All right, well, we are going to get started. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Greensboro Chamber of Commerce's Daily Action Call. I'm Deborah Hooper, the COO for the Chamber, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. If you've joined us before on Daily Action Calls, we want to welcome you back. We're planning to host a Tuesday Action Call at 3 p.m. every week, beginning Tuesday, July 7th. With new information needing to be shared on a number of topics that we've covered over the last few months of COVID-19, as well as some brand new topics that we think you're going to find interesting and relevant, we decided to bring back a weekly call. We would love to have you also follow us on social media if you're not already. Please join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can find us using @GSO Chamber for the latest information. So I do want you to think of today as a live recording of a podcast. And so the recording of this call is going to be made available on the Chamber's YouTube channel for everyone on the call who wants to go back and listen or watch again. And for those who couldn't be with us at 3 o'clock today, they can certainly watch it at a time that's convenient for them. I do want to share a reminder with everyone. If you have not yet, please fill out your 2020 U.S. Census form and encourage others to do the same. We need to make sure that we do have a strong completion rate here in Guilford County. I know today I checked and we are 9th in the state for our completion rate of 63.2%. So while we're in the top 10, we certainly want to get as close to 100% as possible. So that would allow us to get some additional congressional seats and additional federal funding that we need and deserve, especially considering our growth since the last census was taken back in 2010. I also want to thank our Circle of Champions partners, and I'm going to share a little screen that has, and they're gone. Well, let me just call that out. I'm just going to call them out. So at the platinum level, we have a Legacy Federal Credit Union, Cone Health, Lincoln Financial Group, Truliant Federal Credit Union, VF Corporation. And at the gold level, we have Novant Health. At the silver level, we have Global Brands Group, Kelly Office Solutions, Ralph Lauren, Stratton Capital, and Wake Forest Baptist Health. These different companies support us with our program year-round and enable us to bring programming like this to you today. So we thank them. On the call today, we're going back to a topic and hitting the refresh button because there are some updates that need to be shared with all of you. And I'm talking about the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, as we've come to know it, PPP loans, and how to get forgiveness of these loans. And with us are 4 experts on this subject, and I'd like to introduce them now. We have Damian Gorham, Vice President, Commercial Loan Officer for M&F Bank. We have Rhonda Joyce, Executive Vice President, Regional President for American National Bank and Trust Company. We have Daniel Stratton, Associate Attorney with Tuggle Duggins, and Irish Thurston, who's Tax Manager with Bernard Robinson. So welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us. And I am going to share a reminder with everyone on the call. If you have questions, please put them in the chat room and our speakers will be glad to answer them. We're going to go through a discussion. It may be that we cover the questions you may have come into today's call with. And so any additional questions that you would like answered, we'll be glad to get to those. And I'll facilitate those after we go through the initial conversation. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to get started. As we all know, the loan forgiveness piece of PPP has been the most appealing of this particular relief option during this COVID-19 period. And it has had changing eligibility requirements that have made it somewhat difficult for loan recipients to understand how much of their PPP loan they may have to pay back. Also, there's been some recent legislation that provides some additional flexibility with this particular program and additional guidance from other governmental agencies that may make the loan forgiveness application process easier. So we're going to go over what you need to know to manage your PPP loan forgiveness requirements and ensure that you get the maximum benefits. Before we, get into some of the details of the updates, I do want to briefly set up the framework for our PPP discussion. And Rhonda, I'm going to start with you and ask you to just briefly describe the PPP loan application process. What does the borrower have to do and what does the bank have to do?
Okay. Thanks, Deborah, for having me today. And I'll start out by saying there's an application the borrower will have to complete. It's Form 2483. Complete that form, and then any numbers put on that form. And I know at our bank, we have provided a calculator to help them calculate the amount to ask for in their PPP loan. And any blank you filled in, whether it be payroll, retirement, insurance, or rent or utilities, we also required backup information to verify that at the time of application. The bank's requirement was to verify that application and that we felt that the numbers put in the application were accurate and correct. And then we reviewed everything submitted to us, and we actually had to do a lender application to go along with each application. That was then submitted to, all the information was submitted up to the SBA. So, it was a little bit cumbersome on the front end too, making sure we could verify everything, which would only protect them hopefully on this backside and maybe make the process a little easier for us. But, verifying the numbers on the front that they were using were actual numbers they had experienced in their own companies.
Thank you, Rhonda. That's a great brief summary of this whole relief option. So Damien, I'm going to come to you next and just ask, can businesses still get a PPP loan? And are there still PPP funds available for lending? Are the banks still taking applications? And if so, for how much longer? Is there a deadline?
Yes, the businesses can still get the PPP loan. They can still submit applications. As of this morning, we were still accepting them. I actually processed one this morning. So I'm not sure about the deadline. The SBA has not given guidance. I think it's a function of when the funds run out that they appropriated for it. And the second tranche of funds that they put out, that they started retaking applications on April 27th, they wanted that to go to smaller banks. And so, these are much smaller loans than what happened in the first tranche. So the money's, I think, is being used as intended to really help the smaller businesses. So hopefully, we'll be able to continue to help a lot more small businesses. I know you're going to get into it later, but what's happening is this application period, this open period, is running past basically some of those safe harbor deadlines that they've set. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. Constantly communicating with the SBA to ask us, hey, let us know. But yes, you can still apply for an SBA loan, a PPP loan right now. Your bank should be taking them. I think, Rhonda, you guys still taking them as well? Yes.
We are taking them. We do have a cutoff. Right now they're saying the cutoff to apply for one is June 30th with the SBA, but there's talks amongst everyone that deadline could get extended because there's money still available. But that has not been passed yet. But right now, we are not making our deadline June 30th to take an application because we have to have time to process it. It has to be in the SBA's hands by June 30th. So we have, in our bank, set a deadline of June 24th, just so we have the time to make sure we have everything in order to get it to SBA in time. But if they extend that deadline, then we'll probably be extending right with everybody else.
Okay, so I think the good news is that there still are some loan funds available. If anyone wants to apply for a PPP loan, they should definitely check with their bank or other lending institution to apply and be approved. So thank you for that. Daniel and Irish, I do want to talk with both of you about what your experience has been as you've been engaged in the PPP loan application process, and what are some of the top pieces of advice that you have needed to share with businesses to help them with with their loan applications. So Daniel, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of kind of where our clients have been, it's tracked pretty closely to kind of the different phases that everyone has been in. You know, right after the bill passed, there was a rush of information requests. You know, what do we need to apply? And then, you know, now that we're getting into the forgiveness piece, what do we need to apply for forgiveness? I think the biggest thing that we've really seen, and it makes a lot of sense, is people just want to make sure that they're doing everything they need to do to get the maximum amount of forgiveness. And, you know, I'd say the biggest piece of advice that we've really kind of been giving to our clients is twofold. One is, you know, be willing to be flexible on this. The regulations are coming out quickly. They're changing sometimes. You might think you have the answer on Monday, and then by Wednesday, you might think it's a totally different answer. So just be flexible with what, you know, your ability to keep your make sure you're keeping records so that you have everything you need. And I think the biggest thing is, you know, just kind of operate in good faith in everything that you do. If, you know, this is not probably one of those programs where it makes sense to try and push on the outer edges to maximize every dollar, but rather to kind of stay in the clearly defined lanes of what is and is not forgiven, just so that, you know, you're not putting yourself in a position where you might be spending money that ultimately isn't forgiven. So, you know, stick to the things that are very clearly laid out in the regulations and the statutes, like the clearly defined utilities, like the clearly defined payroll costs, and then just kind of live there.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Irish, what's been your experience at Bernard Robinson?
Yes, it's been about the same as what Daniel said. Just the variety of questions from what is the PPP loan? Am I able to get it? What are the qualifications to apply for the loan? To other questions such as, you know, what type of utilities will go under utilities? What are the payroll costs? We have had also more specific questions dealing with our larger clients about affiliate groups, and more specific questions relating to S Corps. But other than that, yeah, just variety of questions across the board. And we've just been doing our best to try and advise them, giving them tools and templates, just helping them the best way that we can with getting them the loan. And then now we're gonna start switching focus to the forgiveness form and helping them fill that out.
Well, thank you. All right, so I want to just briefly touch on this certification issue that initially borrowers had to assess and certify their economic need for a PPP loan. Rhonda, I'm going to come back to you because I think that you alluded to it in your opening remarks about the PPP loan application process. So what does this mean to have to certify your economic need for a PPP loan, and how does this impact a borrower's ability to have their loan forgiven?
Well, they're certifying on the front end. On that application, there was a place either for them to initial or sign by that they fell in that category to get the loan. They had the need or having issues through, wanting to maintain their employee base. And so, you know, we took that certification. That's kind of like going to court and saying, you're certifying that this is the truth. So we relied on that certification, you know, and as long as that statement's true, that will carry through the whole forgiveness part. Because there's certifications on the back end that go with that on the forgiveness end as well as it was on the front end. Did they suffer an economic impact due to the pandemic we're in?
Yes, and when we get into the forgiveness piece, I saw that on the Form 3508EZ, so we'll talk about the back end piece. Has there been any change, like for someone who would be seeking a PPP loan right now? Was there any change to that certification on the front end? Do they still have to certify that they have an economic need?
Yes,
okay.
That certification is still on the application today.
Okay, great. All right, so let's get into the forgiveness piece of the PPP loan, because certainly that has been the most attractive incentive for companies to access this particular relief option under the CARES Act, and also for nonprofits too, right? 501c3 nonprofits in particular. So I want to talk about some of the particulars about what this forgiveness process looks like, and also I know that there are a lot of updates coming out right now. So Damien, how do borrowers apply for PPP loan forgiveness? Did we lose Damien? Oops. I tell you what, Rhonda, let's have you answer that.
Well, there is an application. There's a 3508 and there's a 3508 easy form. But I would not, those forms are out there today. However, they are always subject to change. Even on the front end when we were taking applications, up until the day we could take the first one, that application changed 3 times. So when people are pulling the forms now thinking they can fill them out, beware that form could change between now and when the SBA was ready to accept those applications. Because as of right now, they're not accepting them. We haven't been given the open portal to put in forgiveness applications. So right now that process is still being ironed out, but just document everything that you want forgiven. That's going to be the key.
Okay, so this is interesting that initially a borrower applied for a PPP loan, and what I hear you saying, Rhonda, is they are also going to apply for forgiveness with their lender that they originally got the PPP loan, correct?
Yes. At least in our case, yes. I know some lenders, if you read out there, sold their PPP loans, so the back-end process could be different for some other people.
Okay.
But I know at American National and probably Damien's bank, we held on to our loans.
Okay. Damien, you want to comment on that? So are you all taking your PPP loan forgiveness applications now? I'm not sure Damien can hear me. I think his video may be frozen. Rhonda, why don't we come back to you with the next question from a lending perspective as well. What are the lenders responsible for verifying with the borrowers on their forgiveness application?
It's kind of going to be the same process as it was on the front end, where we had to verify the numbers they had in their calculations, whether it be for payroll, insurance, retirement, rent, utilities. We're going to need that same verification that the money was spent on the back end. So whether it be your 941s for payroll or your payroll vendor, just that documentation to back up the numbers we're putting in the forgiveness application. So needing all that verification, down to rent and utilities, whether it be utility bills or canceled checks, that type thing. But it's going to be the same verification process on the back end.
Okay. All right. Is there a due date for the PPP loan forgiveness applications?
You have 10 months to apply for forgiveness. So that's a long period of time. And that's as it stands right now. So you have up to 10 months after you've exhausted, after your 8 or 24-week period ends to apply for that forgiveness. And then once you apply to your lender, the lender has 60 days to process that application. And then the SBA then has 90 days to process it. So it's a pretty considerable time frame for all that forgiveness to be done.
That is. So, Rhonda, has that already started?
Not yet, because they're not accepting the applications yet. So we're just waiting for them to give us guidelines on when they'll start accepting the applications.
Okay.
Because we do have clients who have been through their 8-week period and want to do the 8-week period and not go to 24. So we're just now waiting on the SBA's guidance on that.
I believe I read somewhere that banks may start accepting forgiveness applications mid-July. Is that what you heard, Rhonda?
I have not heard that yet.
Okay.
Okay. So is there, I guess if I were a borrower, how would I know once I've applied for forgiveness, how will I know that my forgiveness application has been approved?
Once the lender gets approval back from the SBA. So the lender will process the amount. We'll do all the verifications on the front end, and once we feel like we've got it, then we submit it to the SBA. And it's not totally forgiven until we get it back from the SBA. They're the final approval.
Okay, understood. And thank you for sharing that, Rhonda. I think that's a really important point, that it's not just up to your bank to approve it, that the SBA has to sign off on it as well. Okay. So if a lender denies a borrower's application for forgiveness, can the borrower appeal the lender's decision? Can you briefly describe what that may be like?
Daniel, I'm going to turn that over to you. You're the legal counsel here. So I hope we don't have any cases like that, but not to put you on the spot, Daniel. But.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the answer is yes. I don't know that the process, what necessarily that process looks like, has been fully laid out yet. One of the recent regulations explained that if the SBA determines that you're not eligible for forgiveness, or if you're not eligible for a portion of the forgiveness, that they will either notify you or the lender, who can then in turn notify you about receiving additional documentation, if it's for the lack of certain documents that you needed, and that there will be an appeal process with the SBA for challenging a decision to deny forgiveness. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether, if the lender at the front end says, well, you're not eligible for forgiveness, I would assume that would be something that would be between the lender and the borrower. But if the denial or the reduction is based on something the SBA has done, there will be a process to challenge that, whatever form that may ultimately take. It will be there.
Okay. Let's stay on this forgiveness track for a while. Will the SBA audit forgiveness applications? And do we know how long a borrower should keep their documentation records?
I do know that loan amounts over $2 million, they come out with that those borrowers will go through an audit. Iris, you may know how long they should keep the information.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off. The instructions say that businesses should keep their records for 6 years.
For 6 years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good to know. And Iris, can you talk a little bit about what those records might look like that they need to keep?
Yes, you want to keep records to back up any numbers that you're putting on your application. For payroll, you want to keep your form 941s. You want to keep your, like Rhonda stated, your utility bills, any amounts that you're using to keep to back up those costs. You need to keep documentation for. You also need to keep documentation for your calculation of FTEs. Also for any salary or hourly wage reductions. And if you go to the instructions for the form 3508, they give you a list of documents that should be included with the filing of the form, and also a list of documents that you need to keep for the 6-year period, like not sit with the form, but keep in on file.
Okay. All right. Let's play pretend for a second. What happens if only a portion of a PPP loan is forgiven? How does that impact the terms of the PPP loan for the borrower?
But that has changed through this process too. When we started these applications on April 3rd, you would be given a 1% loan for 24 months. Well, as of June 5th, anyone who applied after June 5th, that term went to 5 years at 1%. So those who applied prior to June 5th, that will have to be an agreement between the borrower and their lending institution if they go to that 5-year period. They do have that option, but that has to be an agreement between the actual lender and the borrower. So the part not forgiven will be put on a 1% loan, either over a 2 or 5-year period.
Okay, so what amount of a PPP loan is eligible for forgiveness? Just to make sure everybody's clear on how much of your PPP loan is eligible for forgiveness.
All of it can be.
Okay, so 100% of it could be.
Yeah, and with the extension, with the option now to go to 24 weeks, that makes it even more possible for all of it to get forgiven because it gives you more time to use the funds.
Okay, so let's go back and talk about these types of expenses that qualify a borrower to have their PPP loan forgiven. Let's describe those expenses just to make sure that everybody is really clear on what those are. And I am just happy to throw this out there and ask which one of you would like to describe those types of expenses.
I'm happy to take a stab at it.
All right, Daniel.
So they largely fall into 2 buckets of payroll costs and certain non-payroll costs. And the non-payroll costs are a little easier, so we'll start with those. That's largely going to be rent, interest on mortgages, utility payments that have been come due during the time of your covered period, whether it's the 8 weeks or the 24 weeks. If you've paid them and they come accrued during that time, you can include those, and that's usually not any kind of issue. Payroll costs are largely what you would think of in terms of payroll costs. Wages. If you can include retirement contributions, payments to healthcare costs. There's some questions about whether severance package type things can also be included, but the big things are going to be your wages, healthcare costs, things like that. The cap is at $100,000 per year for employees in terms of how much can be forgiven. You take that $100,000 salary or wage and prorate it over the course of the period. So when it was an 8-week period, you could get up to $15,000 and some change forgiven. With the extension up to 24 weeks, the SBA has clarified that to say you can now get up to $46,000 per employee eligible for forgiveness. So those are the broad buckets of it. Now a lot of the things are kind of going to be on the bubble. There are some confusion still about what types and what amounts of retirement contributions, for example, can be included. But generally, that's going to be what is eligible for forgiveness. And one final note: the original. So when the bill was first passed, they didn't have any kind of breakdown of what percentage needed to go to payroll versus non-payroll. But then the first regulations that came out said that you had to use at least 75% of the loan for payroll costs. They changed that. The last law that passed a couple of weeks ago reduced that amount to 60%. So now you have to use at least 60% for payroll costs, but that also leaves the 40% available for you to use for those non-payroll costs, rent, utilities, and things like that.
Okay. So it's changed from 75-25 to 60-40. Is that correct? 60% payroll costs that are eligible to be forgiven and 40% non-payroll related cost. Is that correct? Are those the new percentage guidelines?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So it's my understanding that there are 2 types of safe harbors that may, protect borrowers from having any of their FTEs reduced. Can we talk just very high level, broadly about what these 2 safe harbors look like?
Yes, I can take that one. So there are 2 safe harbors for the FTE calculation. One is if you are a business and you weren't able to operate under normal conditions due to local or state restrictions, then you have a safe harbor to where that FTE reduction does not apply. So your loan forgiveness amount will not be reduced by that. There's also another safe harbor where if you restore your hours by the end of It keeps changing now. Is it now December 31st?
I think it is December 31st
Yes.
now.
If you restore, so you had someone who was working 40 hours and during the covered period, they were reduced down to, let's say part-time, 20 hours. As long as they are back up at 40, so they have to be up, then down, then back up. As long as they're back up to the number of hours that they were working in February, then that reduction doesn't apply to them.
Okay, all right. So we've established that the new requirement is that at least 60% of the PPP loan proceeds should be used for payroll cost, and not more than 40% of the loan forgiveness amount may be attributable to non-payroll costs. But what if the borrower spends less than 60% of their loan proceeds on payroll cost? Will that borrower get any forgiveness of their loan?
So that was a real.
Go ahead, Daniel.
So that was a real concern when this new bill passed a few weeks ago, because it seemed that Congress perhaps inadvertently had written it in such a way to say that if you were under 60%, you weren't eligible for any forgiveness. Luckily, the SBA has issued guidance saying that they're not interpreting that way, that you would just be ineligible for the proportion under 60%. So if you used 55%, it would be a proportional reduction, but you would still be eligible for most of the forgiveness.
Okay.
And if you look at the instructions, well, not the instructions, but the form, there are 3 different calculations, and it's the minimum amount that you get for your loan forgiveness amount. So they will still be eligible for some loan forgiveness. It won't be completely cut off if they don't meet the 60%.
Okay, well, that's good news for a lot of businesses that may not, reach that 60% threshold for whatever reason. So I'm glad the SBA came back and said, no, that's not how we're going to interpret this, and are being very forgiving, to use this word in that regard, and saying it's okay, we're still going to let you get partial forgiveness. So that's great. So let's talk about what a covered period means for PPP loan forgiveness. What is the covered period? I know that I just want to make sure that we lay it out for those who are listening or watching. Who would like to take that question?
I'm happy to.
All right, Daniel.
This is actually a pretty simple one. The covered period is essentially the period of time in which you can use the loan proceeds. So under the original version of the bill, that period was 8 weeks, and it started the day you got the loan, or the funds from the loan. The new bill has said that it's now 24 weeks, but if you had already applied under the 8-week window, you can choose if you want to use 8 weeks or 24. And so basically it's the time in which you can use the money and then apply for forgiveness based on the usage during that time period, is the short answer. Now, within that, there are some specifics in terms of, your payroll costs. You can shift it to what's known as the alternative covered period, which basically lines it up with what your payroll periods are, as opposed to whatever the first day you got the loan is. But that isn't a dramatic change. So practically speaking, it's still going to be either 8 weeks or 24 weeks, just depending on when you started.
Okay. I am going to ask this question that's in the chat room, since it really relates to what we're talking about, Daniel. So is it up to the borrower if they utilize an 8 or 24-week borrowing period?
So Rhonda can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that if you had the loan prior to the new bill passing, you can choose between the 8-week or the 24-week period. I don't know that there's anything you need to do to say, hey, I'm now going to use 24 weeks. But it's up to you. Now, I think for loans that have been given out after the bill, I think it's just the 24-week period. But Rhonda, correct me if I'm wrong on that point. If you know.
That is correct, Daniel. You're exactly correct on that. After June 5th, it's definitely just 24-week option. And then prior to June 5th, all of those were 8 weeks, but you have the option to go to 24.
Okay. All right. So what if I applied for my PPP loan based on good faith belief that I was eligible, but then after an interim final rule or some new SBA guidance came out, they made it clear that my interpretation was not in line with what they intended. What do I do now?
Well, on that one, Deborah, they actually gave a time period. Daniel, you may remember they extended it more than once. I think the final one might have been about May 15th. You had times where you could change your mind after you got the funds and give them back, if you felt like those rulings took you out of the meaning of the program was. Okay. So we did, I will say, even at our bank, we had several that decided, you know, I'm not sure I fit it, so I'm going to give the money back. And you just hand it back to us, and that's how you go. But that period, I believe, ended May 15th. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. And it did, they have put out in their FAQs on the Treasury website, they have affirmatively stated that if you were relying on the rules that were in place at the time you applied for the loan, that will still be sufficient even if the rule subsequently changed. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just misread the rule and say, well, I misread it. But if you relied on the rule that was written a certain way and then 2 weeks later they issued contradictory guidance, you would still be fine in that case.
Okay. So we have talked about, 8 weeks versus 24 weeks. Rhonda, how would a borrower who had gotten a PPP loan before June 5th, how do they come back to their lender, and what's that discussion like? I mean, does the lender just say, sure, we're going to extend it to 24 weeks? 24. What's that process like with the lenders?
It's really not a process. It's just really up to the borrower. They can make that decision. It's not the lender's decision. So on that front, because, on the 8-week period, when you did the calculation, it was 2.5 times payroll for that 8-week period. So it really gives on that extra time if they have not spent all of that money in that 8-week period. So, and then they have 10 months for the forgiveness to apply for forgiveness. So there's a lot of time leeway in there for the borrower to make a decision.
Okay. So I'm just going to open this up. I mean, I think we learned that even last night there was more guidance that was issued, correct? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do we think there may be even more guidance to come? And if so, is there a particular issue or a little group of issues that need further clarification that you already know about?
I know that for our firm, we would like to see more guidance on the liquidity testing in regards to what you said about the good faith effort or the economic impact that you suffered during the covered period. And we hope that will come out soon. And also dealing with the deductibility of expenses. It seems to be a bit harsh that the loan forgiveness is tax exempt and the expenses used are also non-deductible. So hopefully there'll be some guidance coming out soon to give taxpayers some usage of using those deductions on their tax return.
Okay. Daniel, anything from your perspective that you're hoping for more clarification around?
As we were talking just before the call, the new guidance did answer one of the outstanding questions that a lot of our clients had, which was basically if you switch to the 24-week period, do you have to wait until the end of the 24-week period to apply for forgiveness? Or if you use all of your funds on week 15, can you go ahead and apply for forgiveness in week 16? And the guidance that came out last night said, yes, you can apply once you've exhausted the funds. You don't have to wait. So that was one of the big questions. I think there are probably still a fair number of small questions related to the specifics of forgiveness. that we would like to see get just a little more clarity as to what is and is not forgivable on some, like I said, with some of the things like retirement contributions, some issues around owner-employer compensation that could use a little more resolution. For a while, the SBA was pretty good about updating their frequently asked questions page. It's been about a month since they've updated it, though, because they've been putting out these rules. So I would expect that some of these lingering issues will likely end up back in their FAQ page in the coming weeks to kind of clarify some of these smaller outstanding issues that might not warrant a full rule to themselves, though.
I'm so glad you mentioned the SBA's FAQ document that's online. We do want to let everyone know that it actually exists. It's a great tool. If you have a question, it's likely that it's answered in that document, and everyone should be aware that they can access it on their own. If they need professional expertise to interpret it, that is always available as well. But it is a great resource to actually pull up yourself and see if you can find your question on that FAQ, because a lot of other people probably have the same question. So, Daniel, also, since you mentioned some of the cost and some clarification, there's a question in the chat room. Can a bank charge for printing payroll checks be written off, i.e. part of your forgiveness calculation?
You know, I'm not sure about the answer to that one. I think what I would recommend to a client asking that question is probably submit the documentation for it, but be prepared for the expectation that that part might be rejected as forgivable. So, I mean, I think that I frankly don't know the answer to that. I do know that you have been able to, I believe that the money that you pay to like a Paychex type company for payroll processing is forgivable. So I would think potentially, but I don't know definitively whether that would be the case.
Okay, and you're right. You know, there are just certain costs associated with payroll that, you know, if you can kind of put it in the calculation and application and then see if it fits and can be approved, why not? We have another question from Terry Dixon. We have not been able to retain high-risk employees. I understand that we will have to have the same number of employees, not necessarily the same employees. Is this correct? So maintaining the number, but not necessarily the same employees if they did not want, let's just say if they didn't want to come back.
So I think there are probably two parts to that question. The first is that, yes, what they're going to be looking at is the FTE number, that your FTE equivalent, your full-time equivalent number is the same at the end of the period as it was at the start of the period. That being said, one of the safe harbor exemptions is that if you have an employee who you reduce their hours at the start of this and you offered to return them back to their full 40-hour week, or you temporarily furloughed them or laid them off and offered to bring them back, if they decline to come back, that won't penalize you in terms of receiving your forgiveness, so long as you've documented in writing that you've made the request and that they have denied your request to come back. So it's kind of a hybrid yes and no answer to your question, which is a very typical lawyer response, I guess.
Okay. Rhonda, Irish, anything that you want to add?
The FTE count has been, I think, one of the biggest questions out there. And I still have one lingering one out there myself, in that if your covered period, your 24-week covered period ends, say, November 10th, but when you read it, it says your employee count as of December 31st. So, you know, can you end your covered period and still wait to December 31st to get your employee count back? So I'm waiting on more clarification. So probably check the Q&A on the SBA website, because I think that's a big question that's been asked by a lot of my clients.
Rhonda, that is a great question right there. So yes, we definitely are going to need some clarification around that. So as we did, first of all, let me ask if anyone else has questions, if you would just put them in the chat room, that would be great. And if not, I am going to ask our panelists to each give us your top 3 pieces of advice that you would offer today regarding PPP loans and forgiveness. So, Rhonda, I'll start with you.
Document.
Okay.
I mean, that's the key. That's the key to this forgiveness piece. Is just make sure you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's, got your payroll records. If you use utilities, you've got the utility bills. If it's rent payments, you've got canceled checks or evidence of those rent payments. I mean, that's going to be the key to get everything forgiven, is to document every dime spent.
Okay.
That is key, because the number one thing here is to get 100% of your loan forgiven. And so it's going to be a lot of it's going to be up to the borrower. Have they documented, enough for us to be able to submit it to show they've used 100% of the funds the way it was intended?
And Rhonda, just as another point of clarification, just because the lender approves the forgiveness application and then the SBA also approves the forgiveness application, the SBA could still come back and audit at some point. So that's why the documents are kept for 6 years, correct?
I think that's right. I mean, Irish at the beginning of the call said we needed to keep the documents 6 years. I mean, as I stated earlier on the call, anyone who had a PPP loan of $2 million or greater will be subject to an audit.
Okay.
So it's definitely very important for those folks to keep their records.
Okay. All right, Irish, let's come to you. What are your top 3 pieces of advice?
I mean, in addition to documentation that Rhonda said, I would also advise clients to utilize all the different options that you have for calculating FTEs. Utilize the alternative cover period if that's going to get you an extra payroll that you can sneak in there to up your costs. Just don't be afraid to work within the form and the instructions just to make sure you're getting the maximum benefit that you can get out of this. And yeah, that's about pretty much it, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, documentation, I think, is by far the biggest thing. And then kind of just building off of that last point, if you're one of the borrowers particularly if you're one of the borrowers that's gotten a higher amount loan, go ahead and contemporaneously document your economic hardship, the necessity of it now. Just put it in a memorandum to your file. If you do get audited, SBA is going to give a lot more weight to your rationale and your thinking at the time you applied for the loan than they are going to, after the fact when you're trying to justify it. So go ahead and just take the time, get that put into place now, and that could go a long way towards helping with an audit down the road. And then I guess the other thing is to kind of just go back to what I started out by saying is, kind of just look at this as an exercise in operating in good faith. That there are probably going to be some hiccups for everyone along the way, but if it feels wrong, it probably is. If it feels right, it probably is. And I think that's probably the best way to kind of approach some of these things where they haven't really given us a full scope of guidance. So that I'd say those are probably the 2 biggest things that we've been telling clients when they've been navigating this process.
All right. Would you also recommend that borrowers wait as long as possible to apply for forgiveness? Is there any benefit in that?
I think it probably depends on the specific person and the specific business. As a general matter, I would probably say there's no reason to rush to be the first one in. Let the kinks get worked out on other people. That being said, given that you have until the end of the year for a lot of these loans, plus an additional 10 months, you probably don't want to wait necessarily to the very last day, because you have the economic uncertainty of whether or not the full amount's going to be forgiven. So I would say, don't feel like you need to have it on day one, but you probably don't want to wait until the last day.
Okay. All right. Does anybody on our panel have anything else that they would like to say before we close out?
Stay tuned. More to come.
I love that,
be patient.
Absolutely. Well, let me just say to all of our panelists today, Rhonda Joyce with American National Bank and Trust, Daniel Stratton with Tuggle Duggins, and Irish Thurston with Bernard Robinson. Thank you. And I'm so sorry that we had technical issues with Damian Gorham. His video just kept freezing and we couldn't hear him, but we do thank Damian for coming to the panel to participate. But you all have been excellent and have provided wise advice to all those on the call, as well as all of those who will watch this particular video. So thank you for that. I also want to share another funding relief option for our small businesses in Guilford County. To mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on Guilford County small businesses and their employees, Guilford County government is providing emergency financial support through the Guilford Cares Small Business Assistance Grant Program. They did receive some of the CARES Act funding in Guilford County. They have allocated a portion of this into a small business grant program. And this particular program will provide some one-time grants of up to $10,000 to help offset significant temporary, hopefully, losses of revenue to these qualified businesses during this pandemic period, and to also hopefully assist them in retaining and paying their employees. Retention of talent is so, so important. So we are going to share that link, but it's basically www.guilfordcountync.gov, where people can find the small business grant application. So again, I want to thank everyone for being on the call today. Don't forget to complete that U.S. Census form so that we get Guilford County's count close to 100%, if not right there. And we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock on Tuesday, July 7th. So not next week, but the week after for our next daily action call. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.